Okay, so this video is now looking more towards the layout of the corporate identity name sheets and also the sort of things that you need to include. Okay, so the sheet that we're looking at in front of us is set out with some balance. We've got some images down at the bottom corner and we've got some images up the top corner, and it's still got all the colour schemes, and in some ways it's divided into thirds. It's not particularly the best sort of layout we can have for them. Now what a lot of people try to do is try to balance the sheets out so the actual images are dropped in, pretty much like this sheet. An alternative way of doing that is just to reorganise the sheet. So it's got the same sort of information on, but if I show you the next slide, that's exactly the same, but I've got all the images on the one side and all the text and body of writing onto the other. Just make sure they're all lined up. And that is a better way of actually presenting your work, rather than using this sort of slide where everything's sort of split up into different sections. It looks a bit chaotic and not too structured. What I always say is, remember, it's as if you're trying to read a newspaper. Newspapers aren't set out like this sheet with images, etc., different stories and different bits added to it. So although this sheet will tick the boxes for the presentation, it's not quite right, particularly if you're going to use your portfolio to get into colleges or further education to do with design. So if I click onto the next slide, that shows the areas where it needs to work. So try and keep your work presented as if it's well structured. Okay, let's just delete that one so we don't keep it. Great. And the other thing to do is make sure you save your work regularly. Okay, so moving on then. The next slide is actually where I've started putting all the names. Now, as I've included all the names that I've actually come up with, this proves that I've done the task, but it also means I've got quite a few ideas, and I've also, in some ways, cut out the ideas that I didn't fancy or didn't think would actually meet the brief. And I've included this little statement at the bottom here, which just says that I've included all the names that I did not select in case you need to reconsider them later, or to go back to them and reselect the ones because they're not liked by the client. In industry, this is exactly what happens. As designers, you come up with loads of proposals or sketches. The client will then look at them and they will choose some of the sketches. I'm sure you've all heard the saying, going back to the drawing board. What that means literally is the client doesn't like what we've presented so far, so rather than having to go through all the process again, what we do is we just go backwards a step, and if everything's documented like it is on this slide, what you'll do is find that it's very easy to pick up the thread and perhaps select some other names that the client might like. Okay, the ones that I've gone through, I've done a bit of a sorting. I've highlighted in red the ones that I think would work well, and once I've highlighted them in red, what I've done then is in the summary is I've then explained what it is that I think about that name that would make it stand out. So for example, if I look at number 3, access all areas, AAA, I've put here, I like to access it, all areas as it would appear at the start of the telephone directory, etc. But it also explains that it provides more than just buying games. And then it goes on to the next one. So I've kept it quite brief on the summary here. Eventually, when I come to choose a final name, it may be that I use a questionnaire to ask people which names they think are best. And that way I can get another method of research into it that is literally based on the design and will have a decision or an input into the final solution. So that's pretty much where I'm going with this. You can see what I've tried to do here is, as I've written down the names down there, it's got here slides 1 to 73. So on this sort of summary, all I've managed to do is to place enough writing in the summary up to this point, and I've carried the next bit onto the next slide, which isn't a problem. And so I've put all the other ones in there. You can see they're in alphabetical order, they've all been sorted, and it just looks better presented. So from 73 to 72, and then on the final one, as we go through them, this one moves down to 270. I've still included this onto each sheet, and you'll notice I've put continued on each sheet, and I've actually explained why it is that I've chose these names. And then the final one that we looked at is pretty much and the complete summary, and it takes up most of the page. But I've got all of the 300 names that I've come up with quite easily fitted onto the page. Okay, so that's literally how to set out that section. Don't worry if you haven't got 300 names, 20 to 30 will be fine, but you just need to present your pages in such a way that it looks very similar to how this is set out. There's order. Try and keep the columns, if you can, vertical rather than sort of spreading them across the page or swapping them from left to right, just so it looks a bit more organised and a bit more control, and there's more thought gone into the presentation of this section. Okay, right, I won't need that one, so I can delete that as well. Now the next thing I'm going to be looking at will be the corporate identity research, but this will be a slogan. So on the slogan, we've done exactly the same. I've used the image that we've looked at in class and what makes up a slogan, some of the things that we can actually put in there, and I'm using this as some way of judging whether my actual slogans meet this brief. So has it got rhyme? Has it got rhythm? Is it repetitive? Is it memorable? All these things are things that I've considered when I've come up with the slogans. Now in some ways this was the hardest part to come up with, because it has to relate to the product, and so what I've tried to do is set myself a target of 5, at least 5 good ones, and as you can see on my sheet I've actually come up with 11, but some of them we won't use. It's presented well. I'm using just over a third of the page. I'm putting an introduction up at the top, so it's explaining what I'm trying to do with the corporate identity, and then as I move further down it just explains the ideas of the slogan. I've explained it was a little difficult, and this one here, the ones that I've researched, simply listed, and I've looked at things that need to do with either the bargains, values and price. So obviously I've tried to come up with different ones to do with the shop front. Now it could well be, again, in the questionnaire, as well as the name for the shop that we ask which they prefer, that these will also have a listing and people can select the ones that they want. I might do a bit more selectiveness and a summary from here to say which ones I think would actually work well. So get us online all of the time, I think would. So as I did with the other group, on the other page all I'll do is just highlight the ones I think are any good. Old school, new rules I think would be good because it would work with other people. Gaming Heaven 24/7 I think is a good one. And then the final one that we'll try to look at is probably, if I use words like hive in the title, then I would definitely look at using this one. During our party might be a simple one, and we try them, you buy them. Again, it's not really related to gaming, but if the name suggests games in a strong identity, then that might be something that I consider. So at the moment I've highlighted 3, and those are the 3 that will then go into my questionnaire to say which one do you think you prefer. Now at this point the questionnaire is something you need to start thinking about. So already I've really got 3 or 4 questions I can already add in, and it's down to us then to use that questionnaire to start to develop the design proposals. So the corporate brand we're going to leave for a little bit. The next sort of stage that we're looking at is really our client profile. Who are we going to ask the questionnaire to? And that is going to be fitted onto this side of the page, which will be there. So over on this side is going to be our client profile. So if I just zoom back in, get all this line back up. And so that will be the client's profile. Now, like I say, try and keep this all standardised so it all blends in. Same sort of font. I can see that one's 14, this one's 14, and we need to make sure that all the stuff that we've got is actually in line and levels. So that one's slightly out. There we go. And that's ready for the next stage.